Spanish-American War lecture. Going to be about Cuba and the Philippines. There's a lot to this. It might end up being 2 parts, so I'm going to get right started. So this is pretty much the same outline, one thing missing, but we've got the 6 different case studies. We're going to be on the second one, Spanish-American War, probably one of the biggest. And it's very simple. I'm going to outline the situation in Cuba. At that point, we're going to kind of stop and assess. You're going to write down what the U.S. should have done. And then things are going to go haywire from that. The USS Maine, the Yellow Press with Hearst and Pulitzer, the war itself, which is actually not that important, Teddy's role, and the aftermath. It's going to be fairly important. Here's the situation in Cuba. It's a colony of Spain, and this political cartoon is kind of instructive. You see a frying pan with a lady in there, and she's holding the Cuban flag, and she would represent the Cuban people. The frying pan is over a flame that is burning over an island nation, presumably Cuba, and the flames of anarchy are heating up the frying pan in Cuba. So, and the frying pan is called Spanish misrule. So that was kind of a quick explanation of how Americans viewed Cuba at the time, that as a colony of Spain, Cuba was being mishandled, and that had led to a protest movement or a rebellion. Cuban rebels were fighting for independence, and it was actually pretty nasty fighting. The rebels didn't have the regular army that the Spanish did, so they were doing kind of hit-and-run tactics, guerrilla-style warfare. A little bit more on the Cuban rebellion. The Cubans are actually doing fairly well and gaining control of larger and larger parts of the island. So Spain sends a new commander, General Weyler, to take over and stamp out the rebellion, and his nickname is the Butcher. Weyler is brutal. That's a photo of him. He sets up reconcentrados, or kind of concentration camps. And he herds the villagers into the camps, whether they are involved in the rebellion or not. He just kind of throws them all in there, and doesn't do much to take care of them in the camp. They're kind of fenced in, so there's not enough food and malnutrition, and people get sick, and there's suffering and death. And so this would be the point where you kind of look at, all right, what should the U.S. do about Cuba? You have an island nation near us that is a colony. It's being misruled. It has a rebellion going on. What should we do? We have economic interests there. We have Americans own land, so about $50 million worth of investment. A lot of that is sugar plantations. There's sugar again. We do a lot of trade with them, and we're actually interested in having the island. We had tried to buy Cuba from Spain previously, but had been rejected. We also had this, so those are some interests, some principles. You know, we have this anti-colonial feeling that we want to support the little guys. We have sympathy, humanitarian sympathy for the Cubans who are suffering under Weyler. And we have our own interests, strategic concerns about a European power with land so close to the United States, very close. You'll have to sort those into, you know, which of those are our self-interest and which of those are principles. Should we stay out of it, or should we get involved? Isolation or intervention? Should we use military force, or should we use some sort of soft power? So for your notes, you should kind of make a quick and but make it clear in your notes judgment about, this is what I think the U.S. should have done. What the U.S. does is they do a little kind of something between soft and hard power. They send a U.S. naval warship to Havana Harbor in Cuba to protect American interests. That's the main there. 1898, just about, what is that, 118 years ago in a few weeks, That is the USS Maine. It blows up right in the harbor of Havana. It sinks, and over 200 sailors on board die. How did it happen? It's not clear. The U.S. Navy does an inquiry, and a month later they release a report and say they don't know. The court has been unable to obtain evidence fixing the responsibility for the destruction of the Maine upon any person or persons. So, not clear. Was it an accident? Was it sabotage? But the U.S. newspapers don't report it. They're very clear in saying it was, as this one does, an infernal secret machine. Officers and men at Key West described the mysterious rending of the vessel and say it was done by design, not by an accident. There's another one. Crisis is at hand, growing belief in Spanish treachery. In fact, almost the entire front page of this New York Journal is devoted to the USS Maine. There's another one. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. By the way, this is 1898. Teddy Roosevelt, he's kind of the Where's Waldo of American history at this point in time. He is no longer, he's been assistant police or police commissioner of New York City. He's been governor. He is now Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he's going to use this the war itself to actually become the vice presidential nominee with William McKinley for McKinley's second term. Then McKinley's going to get shot, and Roosevelt's going to be president. The Yellow Press. This is a little bit of a digression. They are the nickname for the early tabloid newspapers of this time, the early 1900s. They are sensationalistic, and you need to understand what that word means. It doesn't mean they're wonderful, like, oh, they are sensational. It means that they make everything out to be bigger than it is. They exaggerate and are kind of the drama queen of newspapers. The Yellow Press is dominated by two very rich and very powerful newspaper publishers. One is William Randolph Hearst, the New York Journal, and the other is Joseph Pulitzer, who's pictured here, publisher of The World. And they own a lot of newspapers around the country, but those are the two kind of flagship newspapers. And they're not tabloids exactly like you see in, let's say, the grocery store checkout shelves. They are just kind of low-level newspapers that the more common people, the masses, would buy, as opposed to the more respectable, say, New York Times. Next slide doesn't matter, it's just fun to know. How do they get the name the Yellow Press? Actually comes from this little guy, the Yellow Kid. They began to print in color, but in the beginning they just were black and white and yellow. And they began at the same time to run comics. The first one was the Yellow Kid. And actually the cartoonist for the Yellow Kid started working for one of the publishers, I'm not sure which it was, Pulitzer or Hearst, and then he got hired away for a larger salary by the other one. But the color in the paper ran, because it was early printing technologies, and smeared all over the paper. So the newspapers were literally yellow. But over time, yellow press or yellow journalism came to mean more than just that it actually was yellow, and it just means exaggerated, biased reporting. So that's a term you should recognize. And that's actually an early photo of William Hearst as a young man. Anyway, the paper goes nuts over the Maine. Here are some other headlines. Spanish cannibalism, inhuman torture, and even Amazon warriors fight for rebels. America gets into kind of a war fever, demanding that McKinley declare war on Spain to get back at them for the Maine. And when I talk about, why do we get involved in a war? Out of self-interest or out of principles? This is like a third reason, that we just get kind of whipped into a nationalistic war fever. There's a term for it called jingoistic. And it might not have even been in our interest to go to war, but we kind of get pushed down that road out of wounded pride. Now, there's some things to note. McKinley is actually not in favor of war. He doesn't think it's necessary. He favors diplomacy. The Cuban rebels actually didn't want our help. They were doing fine on their own, and they feared, exchanging their Spanish masters for American masters, and they wanted to just do it on their own. And Spain had actually already publicly said, we will be giving Cuba its independence. We're just kind of working towards that. So the idea that America would declare war on Spain is at this point kind of unnecessary. There was no real reason for it. Nevertheless, the famous rallying cry is heard, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Sorry for that language. And then there's the Delaunay letter. It's the last straw. A letter from the Spanish ambassador that gets leaked, and he is, in it he describes McKinley as weak. And you can't have that get out and expect McKinley not to need to respond and say, no, I'm not weak at all. So he sends a war message to Congress, and Congress complies and declares war. However, and here's the weird twist, and this is probably the first significant weird twist in how we use our power, or why. Congress adds something called the Teller Amendment from Senator Teller of Colorado. And it says, when we finish with our military presence in Cuba, we will not annex Cuba. We will not take it over. We will leave it to the Cuban people. We'll talk more later about why they did that. But that is kind of an odd thing you're going to have to work into your explanation. The actual war. That is a map of the island of Cuba. You see the capital, Havana, up near the top. You can see the Bahamas just in the north of the map. It's got three parts. It's got Admiral Dewey in the Philippines. It's got the Army in Cuba. It's got the Navy in Cuba. The Philippines. There's a headline from the World. Dewey smashes Spain's fleet. Great naval battle between Asiatic Squadron and Spanish warships off Manila. Why in an argument about Cuba am I talking about the Philippines? Well, a lot of it has to do with Teddy Roosevelt. He's Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and his boss, literally out of the office, Teddy sends out orders to the Navy commanders, Admiral Dewey in this case, prepare for an attack in the Pacific. The Philippines are a Spanish colony. Honestly, have nothing to do with Cuba, but they're still a Spanish colony, and we are at war with Spain. And so Dewey does a surprise attack on the Spanish at Manila, the capital of the Philippines. And it's just a thrashing. It soundly defeats the Spanish fleet easily and conquers the Philippines. And there in red, that is the Philippine chain of islands, the archipelago. Now what? Victory in the Philippines is going to create a problem, but we'll come back to that. What are we going to do with the Philippines? Second part of the war, the Army in Cuba. There's a photograph of our good friend Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Rider Regiment. The Army hasn't had a big war in a while. The Indian Wars were 10, 20 years earlier, and more than that, 15 or 20 years earlier. And so the Army is kind of out of use and rusty. They're disorganized. They're poorly led. They're undersupplied. They actually had a lot of the wrong supplies. Some of them had kind of warm woolen uniforms, and they were going down to the tropical country of Cuba. Teddy actually resigns from the Navy the Navy Department and raises his own regiment with his own money, and they're called the Rough Riders, and that you could do that then, and they kind of join in with the Army. Despite how poorly prepared and not ready the Army was, They smashed the the Spanish army pretty easily. Teddy has his famous victory charging up San Juan Hill, and that is going to give him the fame to join the McKinley ticket and become vice president and then president. And the Navy has a similar easy victory over the Spanish Navy in Cuba. And the Secretary of State makes the comment that John Hay, that this was a splendid little war. And in many ways it was. The U.S. had only 400 or so dead in battle. They had 10 times that dead from disease, especially yellow fever. But out of that, with very small cost to us, so you're talking about self-interest, we gained Cuba, we gained the Philippines, we also gained the Spanish islands of Puerto Rico and Guam. And that is kind of an unusual explanation for, how did we acquire all these island territories for a country that never really wanted an empire? And now we're left with what to do with these places, and most of our attention will be on Cuba and the Philippines. But why don't I stop for there? We're at 1616, and it'll be a short finish, a short second lecture, but I'll put that into a second one. All right, guys, that's it for now.